the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, GPS signals can now lead you to the entrance to Underhill, which turns out to be 3 miles to the east of Stonehenge in an old rat mulm yard, frequented by terriers and ferrets. Yuck. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel, suffering from a bit of a cold this time. And this time we talk with Michael Z. Williamson all about the history, evolution, and future of body armor. From the cuirass to the mail shirt to the Kevlar helmet, Mike brings his soldiers' and historians' knowledge to bear on a very cool and sometimes under-discussed subject. Our talk is based on an article that Michael Z. Williamson just did for the Baen.com website that is called The Evolution of Body Armor. And it's up right now on the Baen main page and will be available afterwards in the free ebook, Free Nonfiction 2019, which you can download at Baen eBooks. So that really cool talk with Michael Z. Williamson is coming up. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now here's the news. Hey, Baen Books is proud to announce that the Jim Baen Memorial Short Story Award for 2019 goes to Matt McHugh. Matt McHugh is a writer from New Jersey, and he's won the grand prize for the 2019 Memorial Award competition with his short story called Burners. The Jim Baen Memorial Short Story Contest has been held annually since 2007 and is focused on the stories of space exploration and discovery with an optimistic spin on those activities. First runner-up in this year's contest is Acid Test by Gustavo Bondoni of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the second runner-up is Dangerous Orbit by M.T. Wrighton of Los Alamos, New Mexico. So an international and national cast to our winners this year. Judges for the award were the editors of Baen Books, including yours truly. Stories were judged anonymously. We didn't know the names when we were reading the stories. The Jim Baen Memorial Award will be presented June 8th, 2019 in a ceremony at the annual International Space Development Conference. This year it's going to be held in Arlington, Virginia. That is such a cool trip that we editors here at Baen get basically every few years as we rotate it between us. The winner, Matt McHugh, receives a distinctive award and professional publication of the story at the website in June 2019. And by professional publication of the story, that means we pay our writers the going rate. The contest occurs annually and looks for stories that demonstrate the positive aspects of space exploration and discovery. Over the years, the contest has developed an international character. In addition to the United States, entrants have hailed from Sweden, the United Kingdom, Austria, Canada, Algeria, Spain, and Morocco, now Argentina. This is what William Ledbetter, our contest administrator, says. Moon bases, Mars colonies, orbital habitats, space elevators, asteroid mining, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, realistic spacecraft, heroic sacrifice and adventure. That's what we're looking for. And once again, we believe we found writers and an ultimate winner who deliver just that. So congratulations to Mark McHugh, and we'll hand him a trophy at the 2019 ISDC in May, and even better, we'll publish his most excellent story, Burners, in June at Baen.com. I want to welcome Michael Z. Williamson back to the podcast. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Quite well.
Michael Z. Williamson is retired military, having served 25 years in the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. He was deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom and Desert Fox. Mike is a state-ranked competitive shooter in combat rifle and combat pistol. He has consulted on military matters, weapons, and disaster preparedness for Discovery Channel and Outdoor Channel Productions. Editor-at-large for Survival Blog, which has 300,000 weekly readers. In addition, Mike Tesson reviews firearms and gears for manufacturers. His books set in the Freehold universe include Freehold, Better to Beg Forgiveness, Do Unto Others, When Diplomacy Fails. What was the last one called? Angel Eyes. That's the mainline Freehold, not the Rebel Creek. Yeah, because it's about the beginning of the war.
The Weapon and Rogue.
He's the author of the time travel novel, great novel, A Long Time Until Now. He's been working on the sequel to that.
Should be done soon.
The Hero, written with Ringo. Editor of Forged in Blood, an anthology set in Freehold science fiction. And hey, we got Freehold Resistance coming up in the fall. That's going to be even more great anthology stories by writers who are writing in Mike's Freehold world and developing themes there. Most recently, Mike had a novel in the John Ringo and Gary Poole Black Tide Rising anthology, Voices of the Fall, which was a kick-ass novella. It was really funny. A lot of that trenchant humor that we see on your Facebook page, and that doesn't always get into the books as much. It was in that story. It's really good. What's the name of that story again?
Something cool. Hail to the King, baby.
Yeah. Ike was born in England, raised in Liverpool and Toronto, Canada, and now he lives in Indianapolis with his wife and his children. So what we want to talk about today is this great article that is on the Baen.com website right now, and that will be available in perpetuity at Free Nonfiction 2019 in our downloadable ebook. This is called The Evolution of Body Armor. Now, this drew on your... I don't know if you call yourself an armorer or a weapons dealer or what, but this had to draw on a huge amount of knowledge.
I'm a bladesmith. I'm a collector. I've worn a certain amount. Actually, I've worn in the military. I wore the Vietnam era body armor. We still had that in the 80s. The PASGT Interceptor. They were just introducing IOTV, Improved Outer Tactical Vest, when I retired, but I'm familiar with it. So I wore 4 different variations in that time frame.
So you have some major experience with modern body armor from your days as a soldier, and but you also have a lot of historical knowledge about it as well. Can we talk about, start with why are shields not the ultimate answer, which is how you started the essay?
Well, shields are phenomenal protection. If you're fighting melee with a sword, then a good shield is just about the best thing you can have. The problem comes if you need 2 hands on a weapon, all of a sudden you don't have the shield. But during the Viking era and earlier, a lot of times the shield was pretty much the one piece of armor a fighting man would have. It works with a spear, with an axe, with a sword. And 3 foot wide plied shield with leather over it held at arm's length stops, a little bit of training stops most of the incoming blows. But once you move to a bow, a crossbow, a musket, a rifle, you need both hands, and the shield becomes ineffective. You can't carry it.
Body armor came into being, incredibly long ago. According to your article, there's this thing called the Dendropanoply, which is a scary-looking ensemble. What is?
That was one of the first articulated armors. It's chest and back plate. It's got a tall neck guard that comes almost up to the chin, articulated shoulders, and then basically an articulated kilt. It's not as clunky as it looks. It's certainly clunkier than some other armor. It allowed for range of motion for spear, for sword, for shield. You had arm and leg protection with that. And it had a boar-tooth helmet. And so there probably weren't many of those made. It would have taken a lot of man-hours, a lot of material. But it would certainly be very impressive on parade and in front of an army. And whoever wore that was quite well protected for that era. They had significant coverage of everything that could be heard. But anytime you put armor on, you're adding encumbrance and weight. And you have to balance your ability to move against your ability to withstand blows.
Yeah.
I think of it with a car, steering versus mass. A heavier car can withstand more of an impact, but if you're a good driver with a smaller, more nimble car, you may be able to avoid the impact.
Well, I wanted you to elaborate on this, the trade-off of mobility and protection and effectiveness. But maybe before that, is the Mycenaean piece that you talked about, is that one of the earliest? Were cuirasses, however you say that, cuirasses, before that, or?
No, there were cuirasses before that. That was just one of the early insights and forward-thinking combinations of a variety of pieces of armor as a mass, as a unit. No, the Celts had hammered bronze cuirasses, and that spread to most of the Mediterranean region. Asia had lamellar and scale armor for quite some time, and I've made mail and some other armor. Covering the torso and shoulders is relatively easy. You just make a piece straight down, you shape it to fit, and you're done. Adding articulated arms or flexible arms, especially armpits, is a much more complicated process. But chest and shoulders is a very easy thing to do. You're just making basically a tube with 3 holes. And the Celts then had mail with doubled shoulders, an extra yoke on it. It can be done with hammered bronze. It can be done with scales laced together or scales riveted and sewn to a garment underneath. And that covers the critical organs. So that was a fairly early development all across Eurasia and into parts of Africa.
Yeah. So were the first these laminated partial textile, partial metal or wood pieces in Asia the first things we see, or was there something in Europe and the Mediterranean?
Yeah, the Mediterranean, I couldn't find any readily available images. Some of the early stuff was served both as recognition for people and as armor, was literally something shaped like a dinner tray strapped over the chest. Round, rectangular, oblong. And one of the developments was basically what'd you call it? You just hung over the shoulders with a place in front and back. And that dramatically improves your survivability for any strikes to that area. You've got a shield as well. So from there, it was obvious to fasten underneath the arms, and then you have the cuirass.
And the cuirass is a complete metal piece, right? It's the thing that you think of as like the breast.
We think of it as metal, but it existed before just metal. But chest and back protection under the arms down to about the waist. Say leather scales were used, wooden scales, even stone and bone scales. Mail, once it came along, hammered metal, layered linen, layered silk, quilted fabric, quilted leather, anything that will resist a cutting edge or a point. Yeah, initially.
It's not just metal. I thought it was really fascinating your mention of silk, by the way, where it has a function of protecting from infection. What was it exactly that?
Where silk was available, and it's worked with other fabrics as well, but silk is very strong. So the silk is resistant to cutting, it's resistant to a stab, and if there is a stab, the silk will drag into the wound a certain distance before it starts to tear or cut. So you may get a penetrative wound, but the tip was encapsulated in the fabric, and therefore, if it's an arrow tip that's stuck, it can more easily be drawn. And if it's a spear tip, it's less likely to have caused infection, or sword tip, because it's been encapsulated. So you'll still have a ugly wound, but it will not get as easily infected.
It's like a silk-lined ugly wound when you pull the thing out. Huh?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about this, the trade-off, the math that you put in the article about.
Yeah, so it's easy to calculate individually what your protection is. If you cover a certain percentage of your torso, head, and groin, then you're wearing that the entire time you're engaged, and you can approximately calculate how resistant it is to stabs, thrusts, cuts, and you can come up with a good percentage improvement on your protection, typically 50 to 70%. If it stops one stab, that's double your chances of surviving until the second stab comes along. As far as the weight and encumbrance, that's more of a statistical thing that you have to analyze afterward, and that part's a relatively later development. Although any observant individual, you could go, well, I almost got shanked because I couldn't move fast enough, so I need something a little lighter, even if it's not as good a protection.
So what was the next development after we got it? Well, we should probably talk about helmets also, which came along.
Yeah, helmets of in any kind of head wrapping will reduce an impact blow, and then it's not far from there to either boiled leather was fairly common, or sections of horn or tusk, and then reinforced with metal bands, and then eventually all metal for a helmet. Crown of the head, back of the neck, sides of the jaw, sometimes a nasal piece to protect against a lateral blow. It also depends on the fighting style you're facing. And these came and went. Simple bowl or conical helmets come and go across 3,000 years. The more elaborate ones with neck and side protection come and go a little later. And then eventually you get ones that can be strapped on and provide significant protection. But in the modern era, we went back first to just the steel helmet, and now it's a carbon fiber or other composite helmet with ballistic eye protection, since we can make see-through armor of various strengths. So it all varies on the circumstances.
When chest and shoulder protection came in, maybe groin area and the helmet, that was what we think of sort of as the modern, or not the modern, but what we recognize from our medieval,
as body armor, perhaps.
Roman times, Greeks, bronze plates, and
for arm protection was less of an issue. On the shield side, there was often there might be shoulder protection down to about the middle of the upper arm. Below that, there were often guards on the arms, vambraces. And making an elbow is a much more sophisticated forging process. But basically, modified tubes or cones that you can strap over your limbs is fairly straightforward. Soft padding on the joints probably existed, but making anything more elaborate is very individualized and takes quite a bit of work. So what I know from at least 1,000 years ago, and probably longer, it was not uncommon to have basically iron bars strapped to either padding or leather with articulated hinges at the elbows, basically like chain. And this is actually surprisingly effective because you've got a solid bar along the outside of your arm. That's the area most likely to be struck. Anything striking that, the blow is going to be stopped.
Yeah.
And because that's
So
a
it's kind of
bar,
like
a cage on your arm, sort of, or just one bar?
it's just one bar along the outside. with a joint at the elbow and then along the upper arm. And because it's a bar, it can be heavier than the sheet metal you'd have. But of course, it only covers that one strip. But since that's where most blows are likely to impact, it's actually quite significant protection and relatively simple to make.
Another development that came along, and this is really interesting to me because I really wasn't aware that Romans had mail. I just kind of picture it as a medieval thing. The Celts developed it first, right?
And how did it
We think
come about?
the Celts
you
developed
talked
it.
a lot about it.
So the very earlier stuff, you would have had to hammer the wire out of a piece of metal. That was very laborious. They developed tools for drawing wire through a series of mandrels, smaller and smaller, until you get continuous, consistent gauge of wire. Repairs or some of the cheaper stuff, the rings are just closed and left butted together. But ideally, you want to overlap them slightly, hammer them flat, drive a wedge in, and rivet the dome. It takes some practice to do. I've done it. And there's people who've done entire suits out of it. And I did a few dozen rings and decided I understood the process and didn't really have any interest in doing 50,000 more of them. At that point, that's what apprentices are for. So it's labor intensive, and time intensive, and it does use a lot of metal, but it's very flexible. It's quite strong. If you put riveted or welded mail over padding, it will stop most melee weapons.
Straight-on sword thrust can be stopped by mail.
It depends on the circumstances. The mail is strong enough to resist the splitting of the rings to a point. You've got soft padding behind it, which is going to deflect. So it's like trying to punch a hole in something that's it's moving. It's not firmly placed.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like trying to hang up a piece of leather and jab a hole in it with a sharp knife. It's much easier when you can stretch it out and apply pressure directly to a single point. Simple physics. And then, of course, the person behind is going to be moving and deflecting as well if they have any kind of warning of the attack coming.
Now you have a picture, an image of a reenactor in Roman mail. Did it evolve into the Middle Ages, or was it essentially the same, or?
The fabrication basically stayed the same. I believe the Romans used frequently punched rings for every other row. They were just punched out of a sheet. And then the alternate rings were butted. So that wasn't quite as strong as having everything riveted, but it was a heck of a lot faster to produce. And, of course, they could buy individual armor, so some of them probably did buy stuff that was riveted.
What does riveted mean?
You overlap the ends, punch a small hole, and the best technique is to put a small wedge of metal through and then hammer over the pointed end so the ring is riveted closed. And each one's linked to 4 others around it. So if they're all riveted to themselves and linked to each other, it makes a fairly substantial amount of both mass and strength to get through.
So this is riveted mail is like the mithril of mail armor. It's supple and it feels good
to wear, and
yes,
yet it's incredibly strong.
And it continued in common use, depending on where you are in the world, through the 1930s. It was still in use in parts of the Middle East and Persia and India, up until less than a century ago. And it's been used since then for shark suits, for butcher gloves, flexible metal mesh.
It's crazy. It's a technology that keeps giving to protect us.
We know that it existed in the Viking era. There's documentation of several people wearing it. They found residual pieces, including a couple they found in Greenland that had been turned into toys and then left behind, and the locals were, the Greenlanders were using them. But we don't have much in the way of hard physical evidence in most of the Viking world. So it existed, but it was not common. Whereas, in movies would have you believe everyone ran around in mail, but you're talking several head of cattle in cost for the materials and labor. It wasn't something you would have if you were not a dedicated professional warrior.
Even the normal warriors who had leather armor, that's still pretty expensive stuff to make. I mean, it costs you a cow, right?
Yeah, leather actually wasn't as common as it's portrayed, because yes, you have to sacrifice a cow per armor, and it has to be a bull, and it has to be, I think it's 2 or 3 years, but I'm not sure, which is why I didn't specify in the article. So that's a draft animal you can't use. You're not getting the best meat out of it, and you've sacrificed the entire animal for the purpose of tanning its hide and turning it into armor. And of course, when that armor gets cut, you have to replace whole pieces. There's no, mail, you can replace rings. Quilted Amazon, you can stitch additional pieces over it. You don't really have that option with hardened leather. So people did wear it, and certainly if you had leather lying around, you'd wrap it over yourself as additional protection if you didn't have anything better. But if you're outfitting a large number of men, iron was not as cost-effective and stronger in the way to go.
So you could, there's probably a lot of armies that were mostly ironclad, and there weren't a bunch of leather-clad brigandine armor guys running around.
Well, brigandine is just lightweight leather or fabric with metal inside it. That's much easier to make than dedicated leather armor.
Oh, okay.
So you're wearing the leather or the fabric is basically clothing for the armor.
Okay. So brigandine is, by definition, what the common guys were wearing.
It was very common for professional soldiers in that time frame. Now depending on where you're levying your troops from, they might just show up with quilting, a spear and shield. As time went on, armies got more dedicated, more professional, and better equipped.
Well, let's take a step back for a moment. The Roman articulated armor, the segmented armor, is kind of how I think of Romans. Is that like late Empire, or is that?
That was late Empire, yes. There's dispute over whether it was commonly issued or if it was primarily to auxiliaries. It seems to be the visual evidence we have seems to suggest it was largely the auxiliaries who had that. But we're not positive either way. But yeah, it's relatively easy to make. It's a series of bands that fit around the torso and a series of bands that fit over both shoulders. And then it's all riveted together with straps and buckles. And it folds down. You can disassemble it and collapse it down to fit easily inside a backpack or basket.
Like a camping cup or something like that.
A little bigger than that, but yeah. For transport, when you're marching and not fighting, there's no reason to be wearing it. If you're infantry in that era, everything you're going to use, you're going to have to carry. So when you're not wearing the armor, you're going to have to carry it. It's actually, with a lot of stuff, it's easier to wear than to try and carry it. They did have wagons. They did have draft animals, but at the end of the day, they were carrying a lot of their own stuff that folds down and drops into a backpack, minimizes heat, minimizes wear and abrasion, minimizes wear of the straps and buckles, and means you still have it with you.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, speaking of weight, let's talk about the sort of golden age of the medieval knight kind of suit of armor. And you talk about the weight of that and the various, you have 3 basic kinds that you detail in the article.
Yeah, I showed stuff you'd use for fighting, and of course this was all handmade, bespoke, and only the wealthy had that. And then there's parade armor, which is the same thing with lots of chasing and inlay and foil and oxidizing and colors and everything else. And then jousting armor is basically sporting equipment. in between wars. A lot of these, it was a strictly fluffy entertainment movie. It was I can't remember what it was called. About jousting, but it did cover accurately that a lot of these guys made their money going from joust to joust when there wasn't a war.
The Knight's Tale, yeah.
Knight's Tale, yes, that's it. Yeah, if you're a professional warrior and there isn't a war going on, what do? Well, you get some practice in and hopefully get paid for it.
So, what about the weight of this stuff? I mean, there's the myth that you fall down, you can't get up, right?
Right. No, it's actually relatively light because it was all articulated and pieced together. The weight was distributed over the entire body. You're carrying a little more weight on you're just like wearing a heavy coat. You're carrying a bit more weight on your arms, a bit more weight on your shoulders. You tighten the belt. You're wearing it like clothing rather than an external item. So, 40 to 50 pounds dispersed like that really isn't that bad. A bit of practice, a bit of moving around, and it's well distributed. The jousting armor was heavier because it was designed to make sure you stayed alive when somebody was, charging at you full on repeatedly. And the parade armor, they weren't going to wear that much anyway, so some of it actually was fully functional armor, just very elaborate, but some of it was, they didn't care about the weight, they wanted better show.
Why did this come about? Was it because the longbow came about, or arrows?
The bow had a lot of effect on lightly armed troops, and of course on horses that aren't armored. You stick a few dozen arrows into a horse, and they really don't care for that a whole lot. And arrows with what's called a bodkin point is a long forged chisel, and then for penetrating mail, they made them 2-3 inches long. And some of the battles in the 100 Years' War, Agincourt and Crécy, were in the first few minutes 1 million arrows were launched. So even if your armor is 80-90% effective, if 100 or more arrows hit you, some of them are going to find gaps in the armor. Some of them are going to hit between the rings of mail just right for that tip to penetrate through the padding. It's absolutely guaranteed that sooner or later you get overwhelmed. But then the common levy troops were just wearing quilting. At that point, they would have still likely had a shield, but everything gets overwhelmed with sufficient mass. And then when gunpowder came along, the early weapons were not very efficient. They were started as basically artillery and mass weapons, but as it evolved with musketry, it reached a point where this lead ball is going to punch through the steel at a certain range.
Well, this is where, so the firearms change things considerably, which is, completely. For a while, up sort of until our age, where things defenses are catching up, right? Right.
Yeah, I've shot either originals or repros of pretty much every firearm from then forward. The early ones are not very efficient. They're certainly effective en masse against a massive lightly armored troops. The artillery became effective for breaching walls. But when you got to volleys of matchlock muskets, at that point, you're reaching the stage where armor was really not as effective, but there were still plenty of lances, swords, pole arms on the field to protect against. Then slowly those got.
And you said artillery. Cavalry officers wore cuirasses into the Napoleonic War.
Mm-hmm. And in some areas, all the way up through World War One. If you're planning on getting in close enough to slash at somebody with a sword, then the steel is still valid protection. But once you got to fairly fast-loading rifles in the 1800s, and then eventually to breech-loading and repeating rifles, the armor that they'd had was all useless. It'd be useful to you if you got close enough to engage hand-to-hand, but before then, you weren't going to be stopping any bullets.
Yeah.
There were some custom pieces in the Civil War, and there was a limited amount in World War I. I provided images of those ones.
Yeah, that was... What the heck were they using in the Civil War?
Some mail, some heavy plates of steel, backed up by leather. That was probably closer to brigandine for the Civil War. That World War I shield, the pictured of the German machine gunners, looks a little bit like the Dendra stuff. And again, heavy steel plate because it's got to stop a bullet. A bullet from World War I era is capable of punching at close range through the side of a railroad track. You've got to have some pretty hefty steel to stop that coming in. Now a couple hundred yards, it's slowed a bit and less effective. But.
And during World War I, helmets became something for protection from above, or shrapnel.
Right, yeah. Well, if there's shells going off, there's debris raining out of the sky, and you don't want to be pelted in the head with it. So the helmet became the critical piece of armor, because whether or not you got shot at, it was very likely you were going to get debris rain on top of you, little splinters of metal whizzing through the air, clods of dirt, rocks, concrete. And of course, if you're having to go into trenches or into buildings, there's always a risk of banging your head on something. And you want to keep your brains, they work better inside the skull.
Mm-hmm.
And then throughout the 20th century, basically, the flak jacket, the torso armor slowly made a comeback, beginning with what, bomber pilots?
Yes, there was a big influx. World War II, they looked at the wounds the pilots were getting and realized it wouldn't take a lot of armor to stop a lot of that and drastically reduce the casualties. So those were ceramic and plastic plates inside nylon in a vest. Japanese fighter pilots had some of them. The U.S. bomber pilots, and it was the British who developed one aspect of it, had quite a bit. The European fighter pilots didn't really have room in the cockpit to wear a whole lot. So it was largely the bomber crews. And of course, the bomber crews were taking a lot more flak, going in and coming back out. That continued into Korea for helicopter pilots doing reconnaissance and observation and evacuating casualties.
So what was this stuff made out of, and how did it evolve?
That was multiple layers of nylon, much like the Greeks had used multiple layers of linen. A similar effect. Each layer slows the incoming fragment down a bit. And then you back it up with a fiberglass plate, which, once it's slow enough, that will stop it and disperse the impact over an area of the body to make it more of a much more dispersed and much less of a penetration.
So this, basically Vietnam era stuff continued into the 80s until when? When did...
we were still issuing not much, but my Air Force Engineer unit still had some of the Vietnam era nylon body armor in the late 1980s. We were slow. Of course, the Air Force is at the end of the chain on a lot of that stuff. The frontline Army infantry units get it first, which is as it should be, and then their immediate support, and then it propagates through. So the Vietnam stuff was ballistic nylon, which is only proof against fragments. It has no direct ballistic protection. I've got the PASG-T armor from the 80s, which replaced that, and The Kevlar helmet went along with that, and this is the Kevlar vest that goes with it. And that actually will stop a lot of pistol bullets. It's not officially rated to do so, but tests show that it will stop low velocity 9mm. It'll stop 45 sometimes. It'll stop 22s, mid-range power projectiles. And there's still some of that an issue, because it's very good flak armor. So it's still used aboard ship. It's still used by a lot of our allies. It's like 60 countries still use that exact model.
Was Kevlar? I mean, is it the game changer? It's stronger than steel and lighter, right?
Right. Yes, that was the significant change in modern fabrics. In that it's very strong. It's quite light. It's flexible enough that you don't need to articulate anything. It's comfortable enough depending on the weather. Hey, when I was out in the field at 10 below, I wasn't even aware I was wearing it with the parka and everything else. You start doing runway repair practice on the Gulf Coast of Florida in May in the hot sun in chemical warfare gear with body armor on top of it. At that point, it starts getting pretty obnoxious. But the weight's well distributed. It's something that's basically from the time we developed specifically torso armor and some of the accessories to the present, about 30 to 35 pounds is what people will wear. If it's too much heavier, they'll get rid of it. It's slowing them down. If it's lighter than that, they're willing to put up to that much weight on to maximize their protection. So throughout history, it's been, the typical armor has been in the range of 30 to 35 pounds. And it's just gotten better and better at stopping the better and better threats.
So what is the state of the art right now, modern armor, body armor?
So there's three primary options right now, and they're all worn with what they now call a plate carrier, which is the soft armor. And modern soft armor is pretty much proof against any commercial pistol loading. You can obviously hot load a 357 and punch holes in it, but pretty much anything commercial will be stopped by the soft armor. And then you wear plates. You always want the chest plate if there's going to be an issue. I would say the back plate is second, and then the side plates against the under the ribs would be third. And there's the military plates are ceramic layers. The current stuff is rated to stop one armor-piercing round of 30-06. Has a 60% probability of stopping a second, and in tests it seems to typically stop about 6 to 8 rounds of standard .308 ball. And being able to survive 6 to 8 hits to your chest, it is a very significant defense. And of course, we have modern medicine, so your survivability for other hits is dramatically improved. But the chest plate goes from just below the collarbone to just about the navel, just above the navel. So it protects your heart, liver, lungs, kidneys from the front, inferior vena cava, aorta, everything that would cause you to die very quickly has considerable protection. There's also, since it was, a lot of the retailers didn't want to sell to civilians, even though there's no federal law against civilians having armor. There's a company that came out with a steel plate. Now, the steel plate's heavier, but it has the advantage of not, the fragmenting upon impact. So as long as the rounds are dispersed, it can take several more hits. But your trade-off there is a couple pounds in weight, which adds up when it's, every plate you're wearing. And then the new stuff is actually a polyethylene plastic, which will stop rifle bullets. It's not quite as resistant to armor-piercing bullets. It doesn't shatter if you drop it on the ground, which is a big plus, because the ceramic plates are kind of fragile. But it does degrade in sunlight or heat, so if you leave it in the trunk of your car for weeks on end, you're losing some effectiveness.
So the most advanced is beyond uh, sewn in ceramic plates, and now to this kind of super advanced polymer plastic.
It's not as it's getting there. It's it's got some advantages, some disadvantages, but shortly that will probably some variation of that will surpass the ceramic. It's also a lot lighter.
That's what I've always wondered about with modern body armor is how does the force dissipation work, and what happens to the body underneath? Is there significant padding you have to wear under it, or what?
Well, the soft vest is some padding, and the impact is dispersed over the plate. There's a misconception that bullets knock people back. That doesn't actually happen. The bullet isn't hitting the target any harder than the recoil is hitting your shoulder. So if you disperse that over, a plate that's 11 inches by 14 for me, extra large, it's negligible. There's plenty of video evidence of people being hit and just continuing to move. Obviously aware they've been hit, but not significantly affected by it.
So it's really, I mean, just the fact that it pierces flesh and gets inside you and tears you up, that the bullet does its bad work.
Right. Yeah. In fact, the North Hollywood shootout in the 90s was that. These guys fabricated Kevlar clothing head to toe. The police had to hunt down a gun store and get some rifles because these guys are being hit with pistol rounds and just sort of shaking them off and shooting back and continuing to go. They weren't really bothered. And that was soft armor and pistols.
So speculate about armor of the future, which is how you end the article.
Right. So, yeah, we're reaching a point where, for that same 30 to 35 pounds, you'll be able to stop any normal rifle or pistol threat. And that's going to be another significant game changer because then you're limited in how big a weapon you can carry and how powerful a bullet you can carry because they tend to be bigger. That reduces the combat loadout that someone can carry. You'd much rather have, it doesn't matter what how powerful the ammo you ran out of is. Once you're out of ammo, that's it. So the various options become either small projectiles with shaped charges so they can punch through armor. But there's a minimum size you need for that, given our current explosive technology. They make more powerful explosives, but they tend to be sensitive to impact, which is not a good thing when you're running around the battlefield. It's going to be relatively stable until such time as it hits the target you want it to hit. You can go with just larger explosive weapons overall. I briefly touched on concepts like railguns and other ways of accelerating projectiles. The issue is that any projectile in atmosphere is slowed by that atmosphere, and stuff the size of rifle bullets tends to lose velocity very quickly. There are several rounds in the 5 to 6 millimeter range that come out of the muzzle at extreme velocity. We're talking 4,000 feet a second. But by the time they get to 100 yards, they're doing the same velocity as the stuff that came out at 2,500 feet per second. They're just running through atmospheric frictional limits. So that would reduce the range of engagements, although most combat engagements tend to be under 100 yards anyway. So there's a whole metric that will have to be calculated there on effectiveness of ammunition, how close you have to be. These days, more and more casualties are caused by radios and aircraft and artillery, and that will probably continue. But it does mean that the small arms that we currently have will become less and less effective, assuming, of course, your enemy's wearing armor. If your enemy can't afford armor because they're peasants up in caves, that's less of an issue.
And you touch on in one paragraph, you touch on lasers, and you say that even energy weapons are not a magic counter to armor, you say.
Right. I know a little bit about lasers and other energy weapons. The big issue is you're trying to get the best efficiency possible, because whatever energy you haven't put into the beam is waste heat. And we're looking 15-20% efficiency, which means you've got 80% waste heat. So even if you have a power pack and can make some way of creating a laser small enough to be hand carried, there's a huge amount of waste heat that is a problem for whoever's carrying the weapon. I like what you mentioned before we started. You mentioned David Drake, phenomenal writer, and he had a brilliant hypothetical solution in the Hammer Slammers universe with what they call power guns. It's a little cartridge that, upon being activated, releases energy in a linear beam. And if we can figure out how to do that, then that gives us a effective energy weapon usable for the line of sight. Of course, we don't know how to do that yet. But then at that point, armor becomes ablative. What does it take to stop this beam from going through, to boil off your armor as vapor, and disperse the integrity of the beam? And any armor would do that, but obviously they would optimize the armor for that kind of threat. The issue would become, are you still facing bullets as well? Because that complicates the matter.
Yeah.
Well, what do your guys in Ripple Creek wear?
The Ripple Creek universe, that's Freehold universe, but it's before the Freehold main line. It's and they're wearing basically the futuristic polymer armor. They're wearing it. It's lightweight. It's worn under their clothing. It will stop most of the type of bullets they're going to face while they're doing executive protection. And one thing I didn't really mention is I did briefly mention it, the materials with non-Newtonian characteristics, whereby you hit them and the entire surface goes stiff momentarily. Larry Niven used that in the known space universe. You can demonstrate this with water. If you slap the surface of water, you get resistance. If you just push your hand in, you get a lot less. And there's there's demonstrations. I think it was it starch? They filled a swimming pool full of starch and water, and people can run across the surface. But if they stop, they'll sink. So there are experimental fabrics and other textiles that have that same ability. Something hits them hard, they momentarily stiffen up and act as armor, but then they go back to being flexible.
Yeah, and those are things that are real now, that are being looked at and developed. Yeah.
So that's the Ripple Creek armor, but they're executive protection. They're not combat troops.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what about force fields? And you don't get into that, but you leave it to others.
The physics of force fields to get into that, yeah. They've been used in science fiction a lot, and force fields do exist. I'm sure they will get more effective, controllable, and efficient, but I don't have any credentials whatsoever to comment on those. But that would be interesting, although, from what little I do know, restraining a magnetic atmosphere is a lot easier than trying to restrain a impact from a projectile.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's the article is it's a wonderful tour through the history of body armor with some cool stuff about the present and a little speculation on the future. And that is at Baen.com right now. What else are you working on? What have you been working on recently, Michael?
I'm trying to wrap up the next Freehold anthology, which is the Rebels and Resistance during the war. There's a whole bunch of technical experts in this. I went through the list. We've got 3 Academy graduates, like 7 combat veterans, 2 or 3 other veterans, a neuroscientist, an IT security forensics expert, a pilot, several professional shooters. It's a couple of intelligence officers, a former SEAL. If you were going to hold a resistance against an invader, this is the group you would actually put together. I'm very excited that the stories have been coming in. And a lot of them cross-reference each other or overlap. So it's basically, you can read the stories individually, and they're all good stories.
Yeah, and they can write. They're experts who can write.
Yeah, and you can read the linear flow of how this resistance went through the Freehold universe. It starts off, well, we got to do something, but what are we going to do? And by the end of it, they've got a very sophisticated system. They've got intelligence. They've got communications. They've got standardized equipment, and they're ready to go toe-to-toe with the invaders and even proactively go after them. I'd alluded to it in previous works, and this allowed me to bring in people to flesh out different points of view of how this would actually happen.
Yeah.
And then I'm trying to finish up the second time travel novel, hopefully in the next couple of months.
What's that title on that one? Do we have that? You have it, I think.
The problem I'm having is that the title for the first one was so fantastic, I can't come up with anything comparable for the second one. So I thought really.
A long time until now. It's cool.
It was about, I came up with that title. I was like, oh, that is such a great title. I don't know what I'll do to top that.
Well, it'll come to you. So cool. That's really looking forward to that as well. The Resistance anthology. The Resistance is the beginning of this world you've created that's semi-libertarian. You don't necessarily. It's not completely libertarian. And who they are resisting is the human empire created by the UN. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, the military gets basically, large chunks of the military are taken out en masse. And there's an entire star system, but bureaucrats being bureaucrats, they're focused on controlling the planet. And, occupying an enemy state, as we can see from history, is a very, very complicated, expensive process. And when they resist, it becomes harder. And when they have the technical means of resisting at your own level, it becomes a nightmare. When you've got every city in this universe has hundreds of thousands of people with better than our modern phones walking around taking photos, and all that data is being shared into an intelligence network that has sufficient computer power to very quickly coordinate and predict what the enemy forces are doing and know where to place obstacles. Their database, they have to have their own database security because there are hackers trying to steal everything from credit card numbers, personal contact information, harass their families, change their rank while they're out on a mission. Yeah. So there's both. There's a lot of psyops. There's a lot of technical operations. There's a lot of combat. But it always comes down to never fight the enemy on his chosen ground. Find somewhere that's to your advantage and try and force him to fight there. Sap his morale and force him to comply. A handbook of stories that perhaps will be useful in the future. So, given some of the authors, I'm hoping it will actually get read by elements of the military. Because, we've been lucky in that the people we fought recently did not have huge technical bases from which to operate, but we still had some stuff get armor get defeated, drones get hacked. Never assume your enemy is stupid because he's poor or a little behind the curve. So they can catch up very quickly. And if they're technically equal to you, it very quickly comes down to who can throw the most money at it. And if they don't need to throw money at it because You've already destroyed their economy. If all they need is the manpower, you're very quickly spending resources you don't have on property you don't control.
And your tanks run out of gas.
Mm-hmm. Or their GPS gets hacked and they wind up in the wrong location.
Yeah.
Where there's fines waiting for them.
Yeah.
Well, look forward to that and to the time travel book. The article out right now is The Evolution of Body Armor by Michael Z. Williamson. It's at Baen.com and will be available in perpetuity at Free Nonfiction 2019, the ebook anthology, which can also be found at Baen.com in the Baen eBooks retail store. Mike, thank you so much for talking with us about this fascinating subject that you know so much about.
Thank you. It was fun to write, and I hope your cold gets better.
Thanks. Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
Chapter 21. Thwack. Excellent, Ashok told Jagdish. You almost hit me. Good work. The Rizalda stumbled away, one hand pressed to his bruised ribs. He caught himself on the prison wall and held himself there, trying to catch his breath. If they'd been using real blades, Jagdish would be dead, and they both knew it. That was good, he gasped. Well, better. Ashok respected Jagdish. Ratul had taught them there were two types who could become great swordsmen: tigers and hounds. Tigers were naturally gifted, fast, graceful, and everything came easily to them, but tigers were proud, so were resistant to learning. Hounds were not born lucky, but they simply would not quit, and they just kept grunting along until the job was done. Jagdish was a hound. It was too bad Vidal hadn't obligated him, because he would have made a good protector. Jagdish's skills had improved greatly over the last few months they'd been training together, and if he'd done this well during their knife fight, Ashok might have gotten injured. Jagdish pushed himself off the wall, lifted his shirt, and grimaced at the spreading bruise. Damn, that hurts. My swordmaster told me it has to hurt, or you can't learn. Ratul may have lost his mind and descended into the madness of religious fervor, but he had been an excellent teacher before that, among the best there had ever been. A balance must be struck between severe injury, which makes you unable to train further, and the tag and slap games those who play at combat mistake for training. So, as my master used to ask, is it squirting blood or is a bone sticking out? No. Then we can continue. If it wasn't for this bum leg, I could take you, Jagdish lied. They both knew his leg was completely healed at this point, and besides, Ashok routinely defeated everyone, so it wasn't like Jagdish needed an excuse. "At this rate, by the time I'm ready to retire and you're about to die of old age, I'll be ready to duel you. Keep winding your little clock, but I don't think time will save you. The judges may move like snails, but they're not that slow." It had been fall when he'd faced Bedea, and winter was just starting. He'd been imprisoned here for over a year now. Even by capital standards, he must have given the judges something interesting to argue about. Justice isn't swift, but it is, by definition, correct. My corpse will be decorating the Inquisitor's dome long before either of us can grow old. Jagdish picked his wooden sword out of the dirt. "Then I'd better work harder." A wise answer. "How in the ocean's name are you this good? I've trained my whole life." Ashok shrugged. Fighting had always come easily to him. "Strike your opponent while avoiding their strikes. Hit them before they hit you. If they put something in your way, move it, then hit them. They're easier to hit if you knock them down first. There is no showmanship, no flash, only hitting and not being hit. Don't make it complicated." Yes, I got the fundamental philosophy the first 100 times you said it, but I was the best in my class, from the house with the greatest warrior tradition in Loch, and this is ridiculous. All of the legends about protectors are true. Warriors train to fight other warriors. Protectors fight everything. That was only part of it, but he'd made a solemn vow to never speak of the heart of the mountain. The truth of it was, ever since touching the heart, the movements of regular fighters seemed sluggish in comparison. It wasn't fair, but anyone who got into fair fights could expect to lose half the time. "It's like you know what I'm going to do before I do it, every single time." I don't have to have Angruvedal in my hand to feel its influence. Every fight it has ever experienced, I've experienced. It makes you predictable. Then perhaps I should be unpredictable. Jagdish must have picked up a handful of dirt when he'd retrieved his sword, because he threw it at Ashok's eyes. With Angruvedal helping, he could pick out every grain of sand suspended in the air. Borrowed lifetimes of experience enabled him to respond without thought. Ashok simply closed his eyes and felt the stinging bits bounce off his skin as he swayed to the side. He felt the wooden sword pass through the ragged remains of his shirt as he calculated all the angles and the most efficient way to respond to Jagdish's lunge. Time returned to normal, and Ashok was already turning, bringing his own blunt practice blade up, and he struck Jagdish in the armpit with a push cut that was hard enough to break skin and tossed the young warrior on his back. Jagdish landed hard and swearing. The guards watching along the wall had a good laugh at their commander's misfortune. He was enough of a man to let them watch, and they'd gained respect for their leader, seeing him try to beat the unbeatable, without fail, every single day. So the laughter was all in good fun. Soldiers fought harder when they knew their leader had guts. "Are you all right down there, sir?" "Get back to work," Jagdish shouted at them. "Come on, Rizalda. You think in 1,000 years nobody ever thought to throw sand in a bearer's eyes?" Ashok tapped 2 fingers to the side of his head. "I've got the memories of someone who fought a duel where both combatants stood on the back of an elephant in here." Jagdish groaned as he sat up. There was a dark spot of blood showing through the side of his shirt. "I'll have Watt fetch us some elephants for tomorrow, then. That'll give the men a good show." Ashok extended one hand to help him up. It was an unconscious movement, something an equal would do for a friend. Ashok realized too late that he'd just broken the law, but the warrior didn't seem to notice, and he took Ashok's hand anyway. Jagdish might have hesitated to accept the help before, but when you fight against a man every single day, it became easy to forget the caste of their birth. Ashok hauled him to his feet. Jagdish leaned his practice sword against the stone wall. "I'm done. Calling it a day already. I don't think I have a choice." He pointed at the highest guard tower, where one of the men was waving a flag. Red for potential danger, green was for regular business, and blue was for high status visitors. This flag was blue. "They must be flying heraldry. Someone important is coming to visit. Damn it, I wasn't told of any inspections." "Perhaps it's a judge, finally come to condemn me," Ashok said hopefully. "Don't say that," Jagdish said as he picked up a towel and wiped the sweat from his face. "I'd miss our practice sessions." "Don't worry, Rosalda. After they execute me, you could still try to become Mangruvadal's bearer." Jagdish paused. The idea of becoming a house's bearer wasn't something any honorable warrior took lightly. "Do you truly believe I'm worthy?" he asked earnestly. Ashok thought that over. It was a curious thing for an honest, whole man to ask a vile criminal about worthiness. "I only know of one man who may be more deserving, but it is Angruvadal's decision to make, and no one can truly understand how Black Steel thinks. However, I'll put in a word with my sword, and ask it not to mangle you too badly if it finds you unworthy." Jagdish paused, thoughtful. "Does that work?" "I don't know. There's only one way to find out. But I won't be around to see if it cuts your hands off or not."
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And the Southern Cross, Centaurus, Carina, and that most beautiful of constellations, the Emu. Plus, thanks, praise, and a protective carapace of plaudits for Michael Z. Williamson, author of great nonfiction piece, The Evolution of Body Armor. Please join us next time here at the Hammering Heart of Science Fiction and Fantasy. And keep reaching for the stars.